Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks so much for the opportunity to come here and speak to this very senior and august audience. The title for my talk is Insurgency is Dead. Long Live Insurgency. And what I mean by that is that insurgency is changing. Or perhaps it hasn't changed. Perhaps we simply need to change the way that we talk about it and the way that we think about insurgency. Traditionally, insurgency sought to create a counter-state. That is to say, the theory of victory of both Mao Zedong and Che Guevara was that by mobilizing politically, they'd be able to capture the state through military means. And there's any number of examples from the Cold War to illustrate how this would unfold. Yet, since the defeat of the Tamil Tigers by the Sri Lankan government in this very country, we haven't really seen that many insurgents going toe-to-toe against the armed forces of nation states. Why is this? Well, it's my contention that it is because they tend to lose, or at least they tend not to win. Now, ISIS, of course, and some of the factions fighting in the Syrian civil war at present are exceptions to this trend. But I think as exceptions, they also illustrate the point. Once ISIS gave up on their asymmetric advantage, the shapelessness, the dispersion, once they claimed territory and tried to build, they also became a far easier target for largely conventional clearing operations by nation states. Now, states struggle to follow up on these operations. We struggle to deal with the political and social drivers of alienation. And mostly, we just mow the grass. That is to say, we have to return again once the insurgents come back and mow the grass all over again. But for the insurgents, the grass is nonetheless mowed, and this means that they have to start all over again. This presents something that I've termed the insurgent's dilemma. That is to say, the difficulty of asserting yourself as a startup, of challenging state authority, and of establishing yourself sustainably as a new source of power. The track record for insurgents truly is abysmal as of late. There simply aren't that many cases, recent cases, of insurgent groups winning militarily over a state and establishing itself as a new authority. That to me is quite a stunning fact. Yet, if this form of insurgency is dying, it will, and in some ways it already has, started to evolve and to adapt. And it is within this adaptation that one finds the potential rebirth of insurgency as a strategic threat to democratic norms and stability. And what I want to do in the remaining 18 minutes is talk about three broad trends, what I term localized insurgency, infiltrative insurgency, and ideational insurgency. In localized insurgency, the group survives by aiming not for regime change, but for shared sovereignty with the state, so that its subversive agenda can be pursued without provoking an armed response. Now let us talk a little bit about the context underlying this trend. We'd heard a lot about urbanization yesterday, and it's worth just dwelling on it a little bit. 54% of the world's population currently reside in urban settings. Currently, on average, slums account for 43% of the population in developing cities. These trends will continue. They will create large megacities, parts of which are simply uncontrollable by the state and owned instead by non-state armed groups. We see this already today in Rio, parts of Mexico City, and in Honduras, San Pedro Sula. You have these criminal gangs emerge that control territory, that control people, they decide who lives and dies, and they produce no-go areas for the state. In other words, these criminal gangs are operating quite similar to insurgencies. But unlike insurgencies, these political orders do not look like counter-states that are intent on overthrowing the regime, but rather like para-states. Para, because they operate in parallel with the state, and para, because they exploit the state parasitically and suck it dry. So the state may survive this type of insurgency if we recognize it as such, but its ability to govern or even access its own population is fatally eroded. Now, if cities provide one setting for localized insurgency, so do the rural hinterlands that are increasingly abandoned by the state. Indeed, I don't see rural conflict disappearing due to urbanization, But what happens on the periphery will, I think, become more peripheral, at least to the concatenations of power and people in the sprawling cityscapes. Elites in the urban centers will simply give up on the hinterland, they will cede that which they can't hold, and focus on where they think the future lies. And what you end up with then is a patchwork of control similar to that seen today in Syria, Libya, or Yemen, but also in northern Mali and across parts of the Sahel, and also in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. None of the rebel groups that are operating in these areas are likely to mount an attack and overthrow the regime within the capital. We won't see a Dien Bien Phu, because there is simply no point. These groups survive best by staying below this threshold and surviving as a political power, sometimes because the urban elite doesn't care, and sometimes because it's easier for it to collude with a group and to cooperate with it than to defeat it decisively. So this presents a challenge of how we conceive of insurgency. We tend to see it as centered on the government as a seat of power, and involving a zero-sum competition between the state and the challenger in which both pursue the same goal. This lens fails to capture those struggles, which I believe are becoming increasingly common, which exist awkwardly in parallel with the state. And this matters. Yes, we may see fewer climactic overthrows of regimes, but instead, these regimes are hollowed out and lose control. They're undermining the very coherence of a state-based international system. The second approach that I'd like to comment on today is what I term infiltrative insurgencies. In these settings, the group removes from view that which renders it vulnerable to military targeting. So rather than overthrow the state militarily, they seek to penetrate it quasi-legally with violence used covertly and without attribution. Specifically, the groups using this approach tend to pose as a legitimate social movement by exploiting social and political causes and communities. And yet they will use violence covertly and intimidation to infiltrate the institutions of formal political power and use these institutions to implement its extremist agenda. Critical here is the appearance of legitimacy. The violence and intimidation will continue, but they are made to look random and unconnected to the group. This produces a very low signature approach that minimizes international censure and removes entry points for a military response by the state. The two cases that I look at in my own research are those of Bolivia and Nepal. In Bolivia, you had the Cocalero organization, that is to say, effectively a cocaine cartel, that purposefully exploited an indigenous protest movement to place a party owned by the cocaine cartel in political power. The strategy's main components were mass protest and information operations, yet violence continued to be used to intimidate, to bully, to create incidents during protests, and to sabotage counter-narcotics operations. Key throughout was that neither the cause nor the method of the group was allowed to raise alarm among states, particularly the United States, as this, it was thought, would lead to a very strong response. And it worked. Not only was there no military target to strike, but because the Cocaleros were seen as the legitimate social force, no one even recognized the election of their leader as a successful case of a modern neo-Leninist insurgency. This it was. And notably, Morales has used the very same methods, including covert violence, against his rivals once he gained power. The other main case that I look at is Nepal, where the Maoists in 2005 gave up on its military struggle and instead sued for peace. So they developed a new strategy, and in lieu of attempting a military overthrow of the regime, they realized that they would simply conquer it politically. Overt violence therefore ended, as the group instead used social alliances in the country and the international preference for peace to gain political standing. So whereas this sounds like a good news story, a case of successful reintegration, and it was largely welcomed as such by the international community, a closer look reveals the continued use of violence to eliminate critics and obstacles to political power. And here I have to refer you to the fantastic and detailed scholarship of Tom Marks, who's in the audience, who has been absolutely foundational to my understanding of the case. Importantly, the violence that the Maoists used in this era of peace was made less lethal and was never claimed by the group. And so the image of a partner for peace went unsullied. As a result, the Maoists were able to compete politically, win elections, and gain power, without ever really abandoning the violent methods, nor the communist desire to destroy the state as it is. Tom Marx describes what the Maoists attempted as the unrecognized second coming of people's war, and I think that's very apposite. These are groups then using political infiltration, the appearance of innocence, alongside covert violence to infiltrate rather than overthrow the state. And I think this approach explains in part some of the hesitation that surrounded the first deal with FARC that we saw in Colombia. As you may recall, the first deal looked likely to give the group exactly what they had failed to achieve militarily: control of areas, amnesty, ability to retain their weaponry, political power, legitimacy, and so on. Now, the deal was rejected in a popular vote and then modified and passed by Congress. So I guess we'll see what peace truly means in this context. But the fact that coca production has surged by 50% each year since that peace deal does not particularly bode well. Now, the third path that I want to talk about is the ideational insurgency. You will have noticed that narratives play a large role in the two approaches detailed so far. And I thought the quotation by Joseph Nye that we heard yesterday about it being the best story that wins is extremely relevant for this era. In fact, I think narratives are so important that I concentrate on them as an approach in and of themselves. And this is particularly so given advances in information technology. Perhaps the best case to illustrate this approach is Daesh, or Islamic State. And we've heard a lot about their professionally produced videos and articles. But I think perhaps an understudied element here is a dissemination strategy that underpinned this approach. They started, of course, with their own app, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of, called Dawn of Glad Tidings, which helped strengthen and extend a network. And it also used the user's own social media handles to auto-retweet messages. In 2014, this particular approach was generating around 40,000 tweets per day, and it was credited with intimidating ordinary Iraqis, including the military, and also with hijacking the slogans and the courses of rival Sunni groups in Mosul and Tikrit, allowing Islamic State to gain the upper hand. Once the app was banned by Google and other private companies, the group moved to bots and was able to disseminate messages at a similar scale and in ways that bypass our spam filters. They hijacked trending hashtags relating to unconnected conversation topics to divert popular topics onto themselves. And they also engaged in what some commentators have called political and cultural jamming. That is to say, using the rhetoric and the imagery linked to memes and Western popular culture to create a cool look and feel for jihadist propaganda. These messages may not in themselves create new recruits, yet when they're retweeted and disseminated again and again, they blur the lines between authorship and readership, and they create an in-group identity, and through repetition may build receptivity to the ideology. What you create then are epistemically bound networks of believers, both radicalized and radicalizing, and with violence both a trigger and result of the mutual mobilization. I think this is going to become more and more common as other groups reach a technological savvy as Daesh. Already in the United States, we can see alt-right, this conglomeration of white supremacist groups, using a comparable strategy to mobilize, to organize, and even to inspire violence. They have public websites to draw in potential followers, often through bias confirmation, and they then push them along the spectrum of extremism so as to complete the process of radicalization. You have anonymous chat rooms where individuals can air their grievances and receive easy answers to their own concerns. As with Daesh, the receptiveness to the message is facilitated by speaking the same language and using the same memes and in-jokes as the consumers. And this is a way of reaching the youth that conventional media has largely lost. Violence so far has been common in the United States, but it has also been largely haphazard and astrategic. But like Daesh, alt-right uses a form of leaderless resistance, and it becomes very difficult to counter as a result. It's my contention that future groups will fine-tune this approach. They will create new realities online to produce outrage and to mobilize, and then direct violence to pour oil on the fire and pressure governments into concessions based on apparently unassailable social forces. Now, given the heavy emphasis on narratives here, the challenge lies in establishing a ground truth or a common ground that can discredit the movement and draw supporters away. And this becomes very difficult, because within the sealed epistemic context of the group, all opposing voices, by definition, lack credibility and are fake news. Instead, in the vortex of memes and conspiracy, adherents come to feel personally responsible to act against a tyrannical threat that others are simply too blind to see. So this epistemological crisis, if we may term it that, will, I think, be compounded as technology develops further. We heard about artificial intelligence yesterday, and of course we also have virtual reality, and you may have heard of so-called deep fakes, the ability to simulate both video and audio footage to make it seem as if things have happened that truly have not occurred. It's then possible to produce fake triggers for outrage to cause mass mobilization, or even to fake the impression of mass mobilization through bots and fake accounts. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I'd like to discuss the state response to these particular approaches. We're already struggling with the threat of insurgency. The international community of states doesn't have a great track record. But today, at least, we have the trump card of superior military capability. The strategies discussed here purposefully circumvent this advantage. The result is that even without the cataclysmic strikes against the state, its strength is gradually sapped without it showing much awareness or an ability to respond. So what are the implications of the 3 different approaches that I talk of today? Well, I think localized insurgencies have to be recognized as a potentially existential threat to the notion of the state. Today, it is far easier to be apathetic, to think of those abandoned by the state as also irrelevant to the urban elite and its own networks of patronage and protection. The notion of winning back these populations and the territory they inhabit, of connecting them positively to the government, by far exceeds the ambition and capacity of most states. Instead, what we tend to see, both in rural and in urban settings, are occasional raids with little or no follow-up, which usually just worsens the problem over time. This type of apathy is, I think, not an option, lest we lose the state structure in all but name. Infiltrative insurgency. Well, we tend to see insurgency as a military problem, and we're weak in dealing with its political and social underpinnings. And this is exactly the domain where infiltrative insurgency operates. So needed is a far greater analytical readiness to identify these actors for what they are. Their attempt to use the rhetoric of peace and democracy to tear the guts out of both. But we have to be very careful. Much as insurgents have historically hidden among the population, these groups are hiding behind legitimate labels and social movements. And so the state response needs to be very carefully tailored to separate the two. If we act counterproductively, we'll only legitimize the recourse to violence. On the ideational insurgency, we've seen, of course, how Facebook and Twitter and other private companies have sought new ways of countering this threat, particularly following the hack of the 2016 election. Now, the effectiveness of these measures is contested. Ultimately, we are, in a sense, relying on citizens to be wary, to resist simplistic narratives, and to look out for one another to detect incipient signs of radicalization. That may not be realistic. Perhaps governments could play a far greater role and act more proactively to combat fake news, to boost their own information operations, to empower citizens and civil society to play their part, and also to enact legislation and work with the private sector. Behind all of these different responses, however, states must also work to bolster their own legitimacy. It is perhaps facile to say so, but I think it's easy to forget that legitimacy remains the center of gravity of both insurgency and counterinsurgency. So strategies of suppression, censure, even engagement will fail unless a state has a credible and unifying vision for the future. Again, this is a weakness in our current counterinsurgency campaigns, yet it's an area that I think will become even more salient in years ahead. With that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much, and I look forward to a spirited discussion.